I stayed at the cabin because I needed to disappear, at least for a little while, after my mother died. Her death left a hollow that nothing seemed able to fill, and the noise of the world felt unbearable. A friend of a friend had a cabin far from anything resembling a town, and I managed to convince them to let me use it for a week. There were no neighbors, no roads, just the forest pressing against the edges of a small clearing and a narrow stream that ran down the slope behind the cabin. It was quiet enough that every sound became noticeable, and I thought I could use that to think, to sort through the jumble of grief that had taken over my mind. The first day I arrived, I unpacked slowly, methodically. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a single bathroom. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and something older, like it had been closed up for weeks. The windows let in the light, soft and golden in the late afternoon, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and the earth. I walked down to the stream to fill my water bottle. The water was cold and sharp, running over smooth stones, and the sound was calming in a way that made me think for the first time that day without immediately feeling grief pressing against me. That night, I ate a small dinner and went to bed early. I slept poorly, of course, but I told myself that was expected. The cabin felt too quiet, and I was aware of every creak and groan of the wood as it settled. Then, at exactly 2:30 in the morning, I woke. The air felt heavier, the room darker than it should have been. I could hear soft footsteps on the porch outside. Slow, deliberate, paced evenly. I froze under the covers, telling myself it was the wind, the branches scraping against the walls, or maybe my imagination. The steps circled, paused, and then started again. Alongside them, I thought I could hear something else. A faint whisper, too soft to make out, like someone speaking right at the edge of hearing. I stayed still until it ended, counting each second as if my body could anchor the noise in place. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the doors were locked. All the windows were latched. Nothing was there. I told myself it was nothing. Grief can play tricks, I thought. Being alone in a place like this can do strange things to your mind. The next day, I tried to shake off the memory. I cleaned the cabin, lit a fire in the small stone stove, and sat outside for hours, letting the sun warm my face and listening to the stream. It helped. I started to believe it had been a dream or a half-remembered sound carried from the forest. The second night was worse. The wind had picked up, moving branches in a way that sounded almost like scratching. I was in bed, but sleep didn't come. Then it began, a slow, rhythmic tapping from inside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the stove or the walls contracting, but the taps were deliberate, patterned. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. Each one drew my attention, made me feel smaller in the middle of the cabin. I didn't move, couldn't move, listening as the sound came from the walls nearest the bed. I told myself it was probably some animal trapped inside the walls, maybe a bird or a squirrel, but there was no scratching, no movement through the ceiling or floorboards, just the tapping, steady and almost purposeful. I stayed in bed until morning, staring at the ceiling, tracing the shapes of shadows that moved across the walls from the moonlight filtering through the trees. By the third night, I was on edge in a way I had never been before. Every sound became important. Every small shift of the wind or brush against the cabin made me tense. I spent the day outside, collecting water, walking along the stream, trying to tire myself enough that I could sleep. But at night, the cabin refused to let me be. Around 2:30 again, I heard the steps on the porch. This time I didn't close my eyes. I listened, and then I saw it. A shadow, faint and gray, pressed against the window. Paused for a long moment, as if it were looking at me. Then it vanished, melting into the darkness outside. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, and I stayed where I was, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe too loudly. Morning never felt so distant. The next day, I avoided looking at the windows, avoided being inside for more than necessary. Every sound in the woods felt amplified, like the stream rushing too loud, the birds calling too sharp. I slept poorly, dozing in fits on the sofa while the sun moved across the cabin floor, shadows stretching and shifting. I found myself constantly checking the doors and windows, checking locks I was sure were already locked. I started to feel that creeping panic that sits just beneath the surface of your chest when something is wrong, and you can't say what. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had come in while I was outside. Maybe the cabin wasn't as isolated as I thought. Maybe the wind had done something strange again. But each explanation felt weaker than the dread that clung to my skin. That night, I packed quietly, moving as little as possible, aware that any noise I made might draw attention. I didn't even attempt to sleep. I sat in a corner with my bag open, staring at the walls, counting the hours until first light. The tapping began again, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. I stayed perfectly still, pretending not to hear, pretending it wasn't coming closer, pretending it wasn't coming from a place I could never see without turning my head. I left before sunrise, carrying only the essentials, my bag, my water, and a heavy sense of relief. Driving away, I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the road, the way the trees bent and stretched over the narrow path, and I didn't slow until I reached the nearest town. I left the cabin behind, exactly as it was, doors locked and windows latched. Yet I knew I would never be able to stop imagining those nights. The sound of tapping followed me in my dreams, sometimes in the quiet of late nights, echoing faintly, impossible to locate, impossible to forget. I never returned. I never asked about the cabin again. It stayed somewhere out there in the forest, and I stayed somewhere else, carrying the memory of those nights with me, vivid and persistent. It was real. It had been real, and I had survived it. But the cabin, the taps, the shadow, the whispers, they stayed alive in my mind long after I had gone. The relief of leaving was immediate, but even months later, I could feel the tension settle back into my body when I remembered those nights. The memory didn't fade, and I never needed confirmation that what I had experienced was possible. It had happened, and it was enough. I could never go back, and I never will. I remember the drive into the forest like it was yesterday. It wasn't far from the main road, but the road twisted and narrowed until the car seemed to be swallowed by the pines. We had picked the cabin for our anniversary, drawn to it by the pictures online. Small, dark wood, smoke curling from a stone chimney, a hot tub tucked into a deck that overlooked the trees. The listing had promised privacy, quiet, and a sense of escape, and that's exactly what we wanted. After months of work and tension, it felt like we were finally getting a chance to breathe. When we arrived, the cabin was even more secluded than I had expected. There was a small gravel parking area, but it was barely wider than the car, and the trees pressed close on either side. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Inside, it was warm, the fireplace already lit by a caretaker who had left instructions and the key on the counter. The decor was simple: a couple of chairs, a couch, a small kitchen area, and a bedroom at the back. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and something else, something like cold smoke from the chimney. I noticed it but didn't comment, thinking it just added to the rustic charm. That first evening, we stayed in mostly, unpacking slowly, lighting candles, drinking wine from the small kitchen. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, soft at first, then louder, as though something unseen was moving through the branches. I didn't think much of it. She wanted to try the hot tub before it got too late, and I agreed. Steam curled up in the cool night air, and the dim lights from the deck reflected off the water, making it look like it glowed. We sank into the water together, letting the heat seep into our muscles, the cold night air brushing our shoulders. That's when she noticed it. She froze, eyes fixed on the water, pointing without words. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I realized the reflection of the trees in the hot tub's water was interrupted by a dark shape. Someone was standing among the pines, barely visible through the trunks. The figure didn't move, just stood there, perfectly still. I jumped out, dripping, and ran toward where she had pointed. I called out softly, scanning the shadows, shining my phone's light through the trunks. Nothing. No footprints, no sound, not even a rustle that could suggest a person had been there. I told her it was probably a trick of the light, maybe a tree that looked like a person. She didn't respond, only stared at the treeline, tense. We went inside after that, the heat of the fireplace now feeling oddly thin, insufficient. That night, sleep was uneasy. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling the sliding glass door that led to the deck. I kept imagining the figure from the hot tub, standing silently, watching. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The air was damp and heavy, the kind that clings to your skin. When we stepped outside, I noticed small scratches along the frame of the sliding door. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate, sharp, and spaced in a way no animal could have reached. She didn't touch them. I didn't either. I just stared, the unease settling heavier in my chest. The next day passed with a strange tension. We avoided going outside alone, stayed close to the cabin, and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. The second night, we returned to the hot tub. I hoped the previous night had been a fluke, a trick of imagination, but the moment we sat in the water, she flinched again. I saw it too this time, a movement reflected in the water along the edge of the treeline, quick and deliberate. I jumped out again, searching with a flashlight. There was nothing, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been near the deck. We stayed inside after that, windows shut, lights on, neither of us speaking. The fire crackled, but the sound was hollow against the silence we had built around ourselves. Morning came slow, and the sunlight did little to ease the weight pressing down on us. On the damp earth surrounding the cabin, there were handprints, shallow, human-sized, but unervingly thin. The fingers were long, unnaturally so, and the palms narrow. They formed a rough circle around the cabin, each set pointing toward the structure, as if someone had circled it, testing, observing, waiting. I felt my stomach tighten. She stepped back without looking directly at them, and I didn't either. I could feel her gaze on me, full of the same dread I carried. We didn't speak much on the drive home. The cabin disappeared behind us, swallowed by the trees as we retraced the twisting road back to the main highway. Neither of us suggested returning. Neither of us mentioned the handprints or the reflections in the hot tub. There was nothing to say. The forest receded, the smell of pine replaced by exhaust and asphalt, and the tension didn't lift. By the time we reached the city, the anniversary mood that had brought us here was gone, dissolved into something brittle and tense. The getaway that was supposed to be about closeness ended in silence, our hands barely touching as we drove. The scratches, the handprints, the sense of being observed, they didn't vanish. Even weeks later, I would find myself picturing the cabin at night, steam rising from the hot tub, the dark figure standing among the pines. It was real enough to unsettle me, but impossible to explain. Whoever or whatever had been there had left no trace that could be pinned down. No footsteps, no scent, nothing physical beyond those shallow, impossible prints. The idea that someone could move around a remote cabin unnoticed, leave such strange marks, and vanish without a sound stayed with me longer than I expected. The anniversary ended that day quietly, without discussion. We went back to our routines, but the memory of those nights in the cabin lingered, gnawing at the edges of normal life. I never went back, and she didn't ask to. Even the photos we took, the ones meant to capture warmth and laughter, felt wrong. They reminded me not of a romantic escape, but of a place where someone had been there when no one should have been, where we had been watched, circled, and left alone with fear. It changed how I looked at the woods, how I felt about being somewhere remote. The trees that had once seemed beautiful and serene now carry a weight in my memory, a reminder of that quiet, impossible presence. We drove home in silence, and by the time the city lights appeared on the horizon, I knew nothing about the getaway would ever feel safe or simple again. The cabin, the hot tub, the scratches, the handprints, they were all reminders that some spaces, no matter how cozy or perfect they seem, have a way of holding something you can't see, but you can feel. That was the anniversary we got. Not closeness or celebration, but the slow, inescapable realization that the world could be watched in ways you cannot anticipate. It ended abruptly, and it ended fully. Nothing about it could be untangled, and nothing about it could be revisited. The memory alone is enough. The forest never left my mind. I had been planning this week for months, craving a stretch of quiet to paint without interruptions. Work had drained me to a point I didn't even recognize myself, and I wanted nothing more than to sit by a lake, brush in hand, and let the world fade away. I found a cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect, small, wooden, perched at the edge of a foggy lake, with a fireplace and a porch that looked out over the water. The host had mentioned it was off-grid, which I assumed meant no Wi-Fi or cell service. Not that it would be completely cut off from the world. There was no warning about the road. The drive-in was rough. It wasn't marked on any map I had, and it quickly turned into a narrow dirt path that twisted through dense woods. Trees leaned over it like they were closing in. I had to pull over twice to check if I was still on the right track, and when I finally saw the cabin through the mist, my relief was immediate. It looked exactly as it had in the pictures, even smaller than I imagined, but in a way that felt intimate rather than cramped. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and cleaning supplies. Everything was neat, sparse, and functional. The fireplace dominated one wall, stacked with wood, and a single window framed the lake like a painting. I unpacked quickly, then sat down at the small table with my brushes and paints. The first afternoon passed in quiet concentration. Mist drifted over the lake, softening the edges of trees across the water, and I found myself painting slower than usual, letting the colors settle before committing them to canvas. It was exactly the escape I had hoped for. Night fell early. The cabin had no streetlights and no nearby homes, just the trees and the lake beyond them. I lit the fireplace and continued painting until the shadows stretched across the floor. Around midnight, I set the brush down, the fire crackling quietly, and went to bed. The silence outside was heavy but not unpleasant, until I heard it. A rhythmic splash from the lake, steady and deliberate. It wasn't fast like someone running, or erratic like a bird landing on water. It was slow, measured, as if someone was walking waist-deep in shallow water, just out of view. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it across the surface. Nothing moved. The mist hung low over the lake, and the beam of light disappeared into it almost immediately. I listened, straining to hear any other sign of movement. The splashing stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the occasional drip of water from nearby trees and the faint creak of the cabin settling. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer or a beaver, but the pattern was too deliberate, too human. I forced myself to sleep. I didn't leave the door unlocked, but I did check it twice, meticulous as I always am. I live alone in the city and locking doors is instinct. Still, when the cabin clock ticked past 3 in the morning, I woke to a soft creak. The door to the cabin was moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were being pushed from the outside. I froze, heart hammering. Every instinct told me something was wrong. I waited for another creak, a sound of a footstep, anything, but there was only silence. When I finally moved, I did it quietly, holding the flashlight in one hand and edging to the door. Outside, the world was a blur of fog and shadows. I scanned the perimeter, moving carefully across the porch and down to the narrow strip of grass before the lake began. My flashlight caught tracks pressed into the soft, damp earth. They were human-shaped but enormous, far larger than anyone I could imagine, and they led straight to the water's edge. I followed them slowly, my chest tight, expecting them to continue into the forest. Instead, they vanished where the shoreline met the foggy lake, as though whoever or whatever had made them had simply walked into the water and disappeared. I shined the light across the surface again. Nothing. No movement. No ripples. Just the still lake reflecting the faint light of the moon through the mist. I returned to the cabin and double-checked the locks, sitting by the fireplace for hours, staring into the flames. My brush sat untouched on the table, a reminder of why I had come here, but my hands shook too much to paint. When dawn arrived, the fog lay thick over the water, and I convinced myself the tracks had to be a trick of the light, maybe old prints from hunters or hikers. Still, I avoided looking out the window too long. I painted a little that morning, but the strokes felt mechanical, hollow, as if my mind kept expecting movement from the woods beyond. The second night was worse. The lake was silent, no splashes, no faint creaks of distant trees. Yet every sound, the shifting of a branch, the slap of a fish, the distant call of a bird, felt magnified, threatening. I stayed inside, closing the curtains and sitting close to the fireplace. At one point, I heard a footstep on the porch, light and tentative, like someone testing the boards. I didn't move. I didn't look. I stayed perfectly still, counting the seconds until the sound faded. The third night, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, not caring that my paintings were incomplete. The drive out was tense, the dirt road twisting the same way it had coming in, but every shadow in the trees felt like it was moving. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for days. The safety of civilization felt almost unreal after that isolation. Even now, I think about those prints and the feeling that someone was watching from the tree line. The images linger in my mind. The enormous human-shaped footprints disappearing at the lake, the slow creak of the cabin door at 3 in the morning, the rhythmic splashes in the fog. I tell myself it was likely someone camping illegally or exploring the lake at night, but the proportions didn't match any person I know, and the tracks were fresh. Whatever it was, it didn't approach the cabin directly after that first night, yet it was close enough to make its presence known, deliberate, watching. I left early, my paintings unfinished. The week of peace I had imagined replaced by a lingering unease. The cabin still sits there, quiet on the lake, looking harmless in photos, but I will never go back. I know now that solitude can be fragile, and that in the right or wrong circumstances, being alone is not always safe. The fog on the water, the tracks in the mud, and the silent weight of those trees are burned into my memory, a reminder that sometimes it's not what you see, but what you know is there that matters most. I found the cabin tucked deep into a stretch of forest that was largely ignored except by hunters during the season. The landowner had given me permission to stay there, though he warned that it had been abandoned for years and that the last occupant had vanished without a trace. The place looked exactly as he described. Weathered, wooden planks darkened by age and rain, windows streaked with grime, and a porch sagging slightly under its own weight. It smelled faintly of damp earth and old pine, with a hint of smoke lingering from the fireplace. The fireplace itself was full of soot but completely empty of wood. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd brought a camping stove and plenty of supplies, planning to cook simple meals and sleep in the loft above the main room. The first evening was quiet. The sun dropped behind the trees, turning the clearing into a dim, cold green. I stacked some of my supplies against the wall and settled into the loft, a narrow platform above the main room with just enough space for a sleeping bag and a small backpack. The loft floor creaked under each step, and I noticed the boards were worn and uneven, with gaps that revealed the room below. I thought about the previous occupant, the hunter who had disappeared, and tried not to let my imagination fill in details. I convinced myself that the cabin was simply old, empty, and lonely, not haunted or dangerous. Night fell quickly. I kept a small lantern on, reading for a while until the light became too harsh on my eyes. When I finally lay down, the wind outside pushed through gaps in the walls, whispering softly, carrying with it the smell of wet leaves and earth. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I thought I heard the scrape of branches or maybe the snap of a twig, but it was probably the forest settling. I had experienced enough outdoor solitude to know that the mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. Around 4 in the morning, I woke abruptly. It wasn't the wind or the forest sounds that stirred me. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate pacing in the main room below. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either, carrying the weight of someone moving with purpose. I froze, staring at the gap in the loft floor, listening. The footsteps didn't stop. I told myself it had to be an animal, perhaps a deer trapped in the clearing, or a raccoon looking for scraps, but the rhythm didn't match anything I'd ever heard. It was too controlled, too methodical. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was just the old floorboards settling, but every pace echoed in the quiet cabin, bouncing off the walls in a way that made the room feel impossibly small. Eventually, the sound stopped. There was a faint scrape, like something being dragged across the floor, then silence. I didn't sleep again, lying awake until the first light of dawn seeped through the grimy windows. When I finally climbed down from the loft, I noticed it immediately. The floorboards, worn and gray, were marked with something I hadn't put there. Strange symbols, etched with a sharp tool, dark against the pale wood. Circles and lines that formed patterns I didn't recognize, but that felt deliberate, intentional. My stomach turned. I had not brought anything to make marks. I hadn't touched a knife to the floor, and the pattern wasn't random. It was precise, as if someone had spent hours carefully cutting into the wood. I left the cabin for a while, walking through the surrounding woods, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The forest was quiet in the morning, the sun filtering through the dense canopy, but every movement of leaves or cracking of twigs made me flinch. I kept my eyes on the clearing and the cabin itself, noting every detail. The wood smelled faintly charred, as if fire had been used at some point, though the fireplace held only cold soot. The symbols made me uneasy. I tried to imagine the previous hunter carving them, the thought of someone methodically etching symbols into the floorboard while living alone for months, maybe years. When I returned to the cabin, I researched the history of the previous occupant. The local library had old news articles and police reports, and I pieced together a fragmentary history. The hunter had disappeared quietly, leaving behind only the cabin and his possessions. Some neighbors remembered strange behavior, odd rituals, and a fascination with symbols and obscure texts. One article even mentioned that he had been involved in occult practices, performing private ceremonies in the woods. I felt a shiver run through me, realizing that the footsteps I heard, the deliberate pacing, might have been him, or some echo of the way he lived, preserved in the cabin's atmosphere. The cabin no longer felt like a place I could stay safely. Even though there was no supernatural presence, no ghost or monster, the sense of someone else having been there, someone meticulous, isolated, and obsessed with their own rituals, was enough to unsettle me. I packed my things, leaving behind only what I hadn't used, and locked the cabin as best I could. I drove back through the winding forest roads in silence, listening to the engine and the tires crunching over gravel, wishing the entire trip had been a dream. A few weeks later, I listed the cabin on Craigslist. I didn't lie about its history, but framed it as a retreat for adventure seekers, those who wanted solitude, time in the woods, and the experience of staying in an old hunter's cabin. I made no claims about ghosts or hauntings. I knew the truth, and it didn't need embellishment. People would see the worn floors, the loft, the fireplace full of soot, and some might be intrigued by the strange markings, not realizing the weight of someone's obsession that had been left behind. Selling the cabin felt like closing a chapter. I never returned. Even in pictures, it seemed smaller, darker, more confined than I remembered. Every so often, I thought about the pacing I heard in the dead of night, the precision of the etched symbols, and I shivered. There was nothing supernatural, nothing I could point to and name, yet the presence of another person, their meticulous solitude and rituals, lingered in my memory like a shadow. I had intended a simple getaway, a night or two in a quiet forest cabin, and instead I carried home an experience that felt heavier than any ghost or horror story. I sold the cabin quickly to someone looking for adventure. I made sure to warn them about the loft and the uneven floorboards. I didn't mention the symbols or the pacing. Some things are better left to be discovered, and I didn't want anyone else to feel the weight of a person's obsession pressing down in the dark, pacing quietly across an empty room. The forest and the cabin were no longer mine, but the memory remained, tangible and detailed, lingering long after the car vanished down the gravel road. It was enough to know that what had happened there was real, grounded, and entirely human, and that realization was enough to keep me from ever looking back. I had been craving isolation, a quiet stretch of time to finally focus on my novel. The city had become a constant hum I couldn't escape, and my thoughts felt crowded by noise, deadlines, and people I barely had patience for. I found a rustic cabin listed in a remote area several hours north, surrounded by dense forest and far from any main road. The host had warned me about bears in the area, but I barely registered it. I was more concerned about weak Wi-Fi and whether I'd be able to send chapters to my editor. The images online showed a small, wooden cabin, snow-dusted in winter, with a stone chimney and a fire pit outside. It was perfect. The drive was long, through narrow roads bordered by trees so tall they blocked the sky in places. As I turned the last corner, the cabin appeared, tucked into a clearing, smoke curling from the chimney despite the bitter cold. The air hit me sharp and clean when I stepped out, smelling like wood and frost. I unpacked quickly, eager to get inside and start writing. The cabin was small, with a single room, a wood stove, and a few shelves. The furniture was sparse but solid, the kind that seemed like it had been there for decades. The first night, I lit the stove and settled at the table with my laptop. The snow outside was quiet, a soft blanket covering the ground, muffling everything. I wrote late, the sound of the tapping keys almost comforting. Around midnight, I got up to stretch and noticed something at the door. There were scratches, shallow but deliberate, running vertically across the wooden panels. I crouched to examine them, trying to rationalize it. Probably a raccoon, I thought, or some other small animal. The marks didn't go far, just across the door, like it had been sniffing or clawing for a way in. I shrugged, closed the door, and went back to writing. The next evening, the air was heavier. Snow had fallen during the day, softening the ground and making everything white. I worked for hours, losing track of time. Around 2 in the morning, I was jarred awake by a sound. A low, heavy breathing right outside my cabin window. It wasn't subtle, the kind of breathing you could feel through the glass. My heart rate spiked. I froze, staring at the frost-covered window. For a long moment, I saw nothing, just the snow drifting softly against the frame. I convinced myself it was my imagination, that the wind had shifted and carried some animal's breath against the glass. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, telling myself I would check in the morning. Morning came, and with it, clarity I wasn't prepared for. The snow around the cabin was disturbed. Paw prints, massive ones, encircled the structure. Some were directly under the windows, as if whoever or whatever had been there had stood on its hind legs, peering in. I traced them with my boot. Most looked like bear prints, wide, round, and deep in the soft snow. But one set stopped me. Unlike the others, it was narrow, elongated, with a curve that made no sense. It was as if the print belonged to something built for speed and stealth rather than sheer weight. The claws were longer and set at odd angles. I photographed it, then moved quickly back inside. For the next hour, I debated staying. I could write during the day, keep busy, avoid going outside after dark. But the rationalizations were weak. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, set my nerves on edge. When the wind shifted, it carried scents I couldn't identify, animal scents mixed with something metallic and cold. I decided I couldn't risk it. Packing was methodical, hands shaking as I double-checked that everything was stowed, that the doors were locked behind me. I wanted to leave quietly, not give anything outside a chance to notice. The drive back was tense, my mind replaying every detail. How close the prints had been to the windows, the sound of breathing in the dark, the feeling of being watched, a pressure I couldn't shake even when the snow and trees were behind me. I didn't stop for anything, not even coffee. When I reached the highway, the familiar signs of civilization, the noise, and the lights were almost shocking. I realized I hadn't felt relief until I was surrounded by people again. The cabin, a distant memory tucked under a veil of snow and silence. Later, curiosity drew me online. Searching the area, I found local reports. Hikers had described a large, dark canine, faster than any wolf, avoiding humans, leaving tracks like the ones I'd seen. Some called it a shadow wolf. There were sightings stretching over years, each report vague and unsettling, describing an animal that moved silently, observing from the tree line, vanishing before anyone could approach. Nothing I read claimed it attacked, but the behavior was unnervingly bold. Standing on 2 legs, circling structures, marking territory, It explained everything I had seen. I never returned. Every time I think about that cabin, I see the narrow, curved print in the snow, and I remember the breath at the window. I wonder how long it had been watching, how many nights it had stalked this place before me. Isolation was supposed to help me write, but it taught me something else. Wilderness holds creatures that are patient, precise, and utterly uninterested in letting humans feel safe. The cabin, the snow, the tracks, they're burned into my memory. I'll never forget that week. The fear was quiet at first, almost polite, but it didn't leave, not even when I was far away. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was real, and it was waiting. And that knowledge, that understanding, is enough to keep me from ever stepping foot near those woods again. The cabin sat deep in the Appalachians, tucked into a narrow clearing surrounded by thick pines and oaks. The road in was long and winding, barely more than a gravel path, and it felt like it disappeared into the mountains. We had been coming to this cabin for family reunions for years, ever since my dad's side had found it in the old rental registry. It had that sort of weathered, lived-in feel that made you feel part of a long tradition. The wood on the exterior was dark and faded, the windows slightly uneven, the kind of place that smelled faintly of wood smoke and old pine. We arrived in the late afternoon, unloading cars one by one. 12 of us in total, stretching across 3 generations, luggage spilling into the cramped living room while the smell of the forest pressed against the open windows. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet you notice when you're used to streets and traffic. Kids ran outside, chasing each other with flashlights, their laughter echoing against the hills. I remember the way the shadows from the trees stretched and shifted in the uneven beams of their lights. At one point, they froze, pointing toward the tree line. They swore they saw something tall, moving between the trunks, something that didn't look quite human. My cousins and I laughed it off. Maybe it was an elk or a deer. Maybe it was just a trick of the shadows. The laughter felt easy then, full of the warm comfort of family, the kind you don't think twice about. But I remember looking up at the dark shapes of the trees, the way the branches seemed to twist in the wind, and feeling the first thread of unease. The second night, the wind shifted, and the air was colder. The power went out unexpectedly, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. It wasn't the sort of darkness that you could ignore. Every corner of the room disappeared, every familiar shape swallowed by black. The adults fumbled for flashlights and candles, the weak flickers casting trembling shadows across the walls. Then it started, footsteps on the deck outside. Slow, deliberate, and uneven. We were all inside. The doors were locked. There was no way anyone could have been out there. No one moved. No one said a word. But the sound kept coming, pacing back and forth as if someone, or something, was circling the cabin, listening. The wind rustled the trees outside, but these weren't wind sounds. The weight in the air grew heavier with each step, and I could feel it pressing in, cold and unrelenting. Later, my cousin pulled out his phone and started recording near the tree line, hoping to catch whatever had been out there. We crowded around the small screen, not wanting to miss a second. In the video, a shadow crouched at the edge of the clearing, low and deliberate. It didn't run, it didn't move like an animal. It just watched. Every time we replayed it, the shape seemed closer, creeping nearer without any noise, until it was almost on the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the cabin lights. There was no face, no features to make it human, but the way it moved felt intentional, like it was waiting, observing, measuring. We couldn't ignore it after that. Sleep was impossible, the house too still and too heavy. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like someone stepping carefully just outside the walls. The night stretched endlessly, and the forest didn't feel like forest anymore. It felt like a barrier holding something in, something patient. I remember sitting by the window, staring into the blackness, noticing the way the branches swayed even when there was no wind, the way the darkness seemed to hold shapes that vanished when I blinked. None of us spoke about what we had seen, but the tension was thick, nearly visible in the way we moved through the cabin, careful not to make unnecessary noise, checking locks 3 or 4 times before bed. By the third morning, The air had that brittle, gray quality that comes after restless nights in the mountains. The sun struggled to push past the dense canopy, and every step outside felt heavier than it should have. We packed our things quietly, each of us moving with the weight of exhaustion that isn't just physical. The kids no longer ran or laughed. They stayed close, eyes wide, glancing at the treeline more than they looked at each other. We left the cabin without argument, without the usual last day chaos. The gravel road seemed impossibly long as we drove away, the mountains pressing against the car windows like they wanted us to stay. After that trip, nobody ever rented that cabin again. It was removed from the registry quietly, without explanation, like it had been waiting for the right family to discover it and then decide they had seen enough. The memory of those nights stayed with us, the way shadows can linger long after the sun comes up. I still think about the video, the way that shape moved closer each time we watched, as if it remembered we were there. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing that could be explained with ghosts or monsters, just the way someone or something had watched from the trees, patient and deliberate, waiting for a moment when we might be alone. The laughter that had once filled those woods was replaced by a heavy, tense silence, and that silence carried all the weight of the forest, cold and unyielding. Even now, years later, I avoid driving past that area. I think about the way the light shifts in the trees at dusk, the way branches scratch the windows when the wind is low, the way quiet can become unbearable when it's not empty, but filled with attention. We thought we were safe in a cabin that had welcomed families for decades. We were not. The memory is precise, visceral, the kind that can make the hair on the back of your neck stand on end without a single sound. That cabin exists somewhere still, in a clearing deep in the Appalachians, waiting quietly for the next group of people who think it is just another family retreat. But we know better, and we never returned. The forest had watched us, and for a moment it had been enough. I remember the trip clearly, even though it was just a weekend, because it felt like nothing else mattered except what was happening right there. Right then, we had found this cabin online, cheap enough that it didn't make sense. None of the pictures showed much beyond the front porch, a tiny deck, and the cabin itself, surrounded by trees so dense it almost looked like a wall. The four of us loaded up my truck with beer, fishing gear, a couple of coolers stuffed with food, and a pile of board games we thought would make the nights fun. Our plan was simple: drink, fish, play games, and forget about school and responsibilities for a couple of days. The drive-in was longer than I expected, the road narrow, lined with overgrown branches scraping the sides of the truck. Every so often, the pavement disappeared entirely, replaced by dirt and gravel. It was silent except for the tires crunching over rocks and the occasional bird that took off in panic as we passed. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was low and bleeding through the trees in long orange streaks. The place was smaller than the pictures made it look, the wood weathered, paint peeling in places, but it had a charm I can't describe. It smelled like dust, old pine, and something damp. We set up quickly, carrying coolers inside and stacking fishing poles against the wall. The interior was simple: a small living area, kitchenette, 2 bedrooms, and a loft. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, which was part of the appeal. We joked about how this would be a real escape, and that night we drank more than we probably should have. The wind began picking up outside as night fell, rattling the windows and tugging at the loose boards of the deck. At first, we laughed, attributing the noise to a storm rolling in, and we even joked about a woods monster that might be watching us. Later, around midnight, one of our friends, Mike, went outside to relieve himself. We were deep in our drinking, sprawled on the floor playing cards, when we heard him scream. He came running back in, slamming the door behind him, face pale, hands shaking. His eyes were wide, and he looked as though he hadn't slept for days. He didn't explain immediately, just stood there, staring at us like he wasn't sure we could comprehend it. Eventually, he told us he thought he saw someone or something standing just past the tree line. Tall, thin, motionless, with eyes that seemed to reflect the dim light from the cabin in a strange way. He swore it wasn't a deer, a bear, or any animal he'd ever seen. It didn't make sense, and the way he said it, his voice almost caught in his throat, made it impossible to argue. The wind got stronger that night, and the sound of branches scraping against the cabin kept us on edge. Every time the window rattled, we jumped, expecting to see movement outside. The jokes about monsters stopped. We tried to sleep, but the memory of Mike's face and the thing he claimed to see kept us alert. No one said much, just lay in our beds, listening to the wind, and occasionally the soft crack of branches breaking in the forest. I kept thinking about how isolated we were, how deep in the woods we had parked ourselves with no one around for miles. The idea of someone or something watching us felt unbearable. Morning came with pale light filtering through the trees. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled like wet earth. I stepped outside first and noticed the cooler. One of the larger ones, the one we had packed with extra beer, was not where we left it. It had been moved 20 feet toward the edge of the clearing. No tracks, no disturbance in the leaves, no evidence that anyone had walked near it. The ground was soft from last night's wind and scattered rain, but there was nothing. I went over slowly, running my hand over the cooler, checking the edges, even looking for scratches or drag marks. There was nothing. The leaves were undisturbed. The grass was bent but not trampled. We all noticed it eventually. Silence fell over the group. None of us said a word about last night's figure. But the unease hung thick between us. The forest felt closer, the trees lining the clearing like walls that had eyes. Everything was just a little too quiet for the morning, too still. No birds sang, no squirrels ran, just the wind moving through the upper branches. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, but full of waiting. We packed up without another word. Fishing poles went back in the truck. Beer cooled with ice from the cooler we managed to carry ourselves, and the cabin grew smaller behind us as we drove back down the gravel road. The drive was different this time. The sun was higher, but the forest still felt like it was watching. Every shadow looked like it could move. We didn't speak much, each of us lost in our thoughts. The memory of that pale face, the figure in the tree line, and the cooler that moved itself stayed with me. Years have passed since that trip, and none of us have talked about it. It's almost as if admitting what we saw would make it real again, and none of us wants that. The forest, the wind, the way the eyes seem to follow us, all of it is locked away. But I remember it exactly. I remember the smell of wet pine, the way the wind tore at the cabin, the tension so thick in the air you could almost touch it. I remember how real it all felt, how human our reactions were, how fragile and small we seemed against the expanse of that forest. Even now, if I think about that weekend, I feel that chill, the tiny hint of dread when you know you're being observed but have no idea by whom. We were just 4 friends looking for a cheap cabin, a weekend of games and drinking, but the forest had other plans. The eyes in the trees, the moved cooler, the silence. It was all a reminder that some places have rules you don't see, and some presences don't need to announce themselves to be noticed. We left before lunch that day, and nothing else happened. The cabin remained empty behind us, the forest swallowing our tracks, and we have never spoken of it since. It's strange how a place can feel alive, not with animals, not with people, but with something just beyond your perception. That weekend is a quiet warning in my memory. Sometimes the simplest trips can leave the deepest marks. I haven't returned to those woods, and I don't think I ever will. The forest keeps its secrets, and I've learned that some things are better left unseen. I had been planning the trip for months. The cabin was deep in the north, reachable only by boat, perched on a narrow inlet surrounded by dense forest and jagged ridges. The owner warned me when I booked it, not with jokes or exaggeration, but with a calm, matter-of-fact tone. Bears, wolves, and the kind of solitude where nobody notices if something goes wrong. I wasn't concerned at first. I had gone on long solo trips before, carrying my camera, notebook, and enough supplies to last a week. I wanted the quiet, the chance to photograph wildlife and landscapes untouched by people, the snow melting into streams, the fog drifting through the trees. The first day was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky in streaks of silver and blue. The forest felt alive but not threatening. I saw a moose grazing near the tree line and a fox darting between birches. My camera clicked constantly, trying to capture everything before the light faded. The cabin itself was small, with peeling paint and frost gathering along the edges of the windows. The interior smelled faintly of smoke and old wood. There was one main room, a tiny kitchen, and a lofted sleeping area with a thin mattress. I unpacked slowly, setting my equipment where I could reach it, checking my batteries, my lenses, my tripod. It felt good to be alone, entirely cut off, surrounded by nothing but wind, water, and the quiet movements of animals. The first night was ordinary. I lit the wood stove and made tea while watching the sunset over the ridge. By the time darkness fell, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the water lapping against the dock. I went to sleep early, tired from the long ride and the climb through the woods, and woke only when a creaking sound made me sit up. At first, I thought it was the cabin settling, old wood contracting in the cold. Then I heard it again, deliberate and slow, footsteps on the dock outside. I froze. My mind tried to make sense of it. Could it be an animal? A bear walking along the boards? But the steps were light, measured, not dragging or shuffling. I crept to the window and pulled aside the curtain. Nothing. Just the water, gray and silent. The dock empty. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening. Every sound in the forest seemed louder, sharper, closer. A branch snapping, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of snow falling from trees. I didn't sleep well, but by morning the feeling had passed, replaced with a cautious curiosity. When I stepped outside, the snow around the cabin was pristine, except for the footprints that had formed a strange pattern overnight. They circled the cabin, all pointing inward toward the door, like someone or something had walked around deliberately. I photographed them quickly, documenting the tracks in case I needed to show them later, and then tried to push the thought aside. It had to be an animal, probably a bear, or a moose. The prints were large, though the spacing and rhythm didn't match anything I knew. The next day, I spent photographing the ridge and the nearby lake, keeping my movements careful and slow, alert to every sound. I tried not to think about the footprints. The air was crisp, the snow thick underfoot, and the sunlight broke through the clouds in uneven shards that lit the trees like amber. I noticed more signs of wildlife, claw marks on tree trunks, deep impressions in the snow, but nothing that felt deliberate toward me. Still, when I returned to the cabin that evening, I noticed the dock again. A thin layer of frost had formed overnight, and something had walked across it. The prints were faint but present, leading away from the cabin and into the darkness of the water. My stomach tightened. I checked the windows, the doors, the locks. Everything was normal, untouched, yet the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. It was the third night that I saw it. I had been photographing the ridge from a small clearing near the edge of the forest, the light fading quickly, when I noticed a figure standing along the top of the ridge. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a wolf, frozen in the last light of day. But the stance was wrong. Tall, rigid, and unmoving. I raised my camera and zoomed in, but the fading light made it impossible to see any details. The figure didn't move, didn't run, didn't even turn. It just stood, watching, the outline of its shoulders broad, the height unsettling. I held my breath, not daring to blink, and after several minutes it simply disappeared over the other side of the ridge. My heart raced, and my hands shook as I lowered the camera. I stayed there for a long time, scanning the trees and slopes, but nothing else appeared. I knew I couldn't see the whole ridge from my position. Something had been watching me, maybe for hours, and I couldn't tell if it was animal, human, or something else entirely. The following days were tense. I moved carefully, never leaving the cabin after dark. Every sound outside made me pause. Every shadow seemed deliberate. I kept my camera ready, photographing the lake, the frozen streams, the trees, trying to convince myself that the wilderness was only beautiful, not threatening. I saw wolves at a distance, their eyes glinting in the snow, and a lone bear climbing over a ridge. I reminded myself that I had chosen this, that the solitude was part of the experience, but I couldn't shake the memory of the figure on the ridge or the footprints circling the cabin. When I left, I packed quickly, taking care not to leave anything behind. The boat ride back was silent except for the water lapping against the hull. The forest receded, the ridges flattened into hills, and the isolation melted into the distant hum of civilization. I had dozens of photos, some of the wildlife, some of the snow-laden ridges and frozen lakes. But the ones I never shared were the subtle ones. An odd shadow near the cabin, the edge of a print in the snow, the faint outline of movement on a ridge that wasn't entirely natural. I never went back. Even now, months later, I remember the way the snow pressed under my boots, the way the cold wind whispered across the water, and the way I felt someone, watching me from the ridge. The solitude I sought had been real, and so had the danger. I never questioned the wilderness again. I left it alone, and it left me alone just barely. I drove out of the city in late afternoon, leaving the roar of traffic behind. My plan was simple: escape the crowded streets and neon lights for a few days and finally finish the book I'd been stuck on for months. I had no real idea where I was going beyond the directions the cabin owner had sent me. He had asked to remain anonymous, warning me that the property was remote and off the grid. That suited me perfectly. No internet, no phone, no distractions. Just the cabin and the woods. The road narrowed as I left paved streets behind, twisting through dense forest. The air grew cooler, the smell of pine and damp earth replacing exhaust fumes. I didn't see another car for miles. Eventually, the dirt road ended at a small clearing, where the cabin sat, low and wooden, with a steep roof and windows that reflected the fading sunlight. I parked and took a moment to just look at it. There was a silence that felt heavier than the absence of people, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I unloaded my bag and walked around the cabin, inspecting it. The wood was weathered but solid, the porch boards creaking under my weight. The door opened easily, revealing a simple interior. A small table, a stove, a few chairs, and a bed tucked into the corner. The air smelled faintly of old wood and pine resin. I set my things down and glanced out the window at the surrounding forest. I realized quickly that I had no cell service. My phone displayed no signal, even after multiple attempts. I had brought a small lantern and plenty of batteries, which was probably just as well. The thought of being unreachable made my chest tighten in a way that was equal parts relief and unease. Late that afternoon, I decided to explore the area immediately around the cabin. The ground was soft and damp, and I noticed deer tracks leading from the treeline to the clearing. Smaller prints of raccoons appeared near the porch. As I walked closer to the edge of the clearing, I spotted another set of tracks that made me pause. They were larger than any animal I recognized, and strangely humanoid in shape with a long stride. I crouched to examine them but laughed quietly to myself, dismissing it. Probably a trick of the mud, or a deer standing oddly. Nothing about this was unusual out here, I told myself, just the forest and its ordinary wildlife. I spent the rest of the day unpacking and setting up a small corner for my writing. By evening, the sun had dipped below the trees, leaving the clearing in shadow. I lit a candle on the table and opened my notebook, trying to concentrate. The forest around me was quiet, except for occasional rustles of leaves and distant bird calls. Hours passed slowly, and I wrote steadily until the candle burned low. I put my pen down and decided to sleep, leaving the lantern on the table. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sound that made my heart jump. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the windows rattled in a way that didn't feel natural. Low growls came from outside, deep and guttural, rising and falling rhythmically. My chest tightened and my stomach clenched. I stayed frozen, listening. The shadows cast by the moon through the trees moved across the walls, long and strange. I strained my eyes to see past the glass, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the faint outlines of trunks and branches. The growls continued for a few minutes before fading, leaving a heavy silence. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting upright in bed, staring at the windows, heart hammering, waiting for any sign of what had made that sound. Morning brought sunlight, but it did little to erase the unease. I stepped outside, inspecting the area. The tracks I had noticed the previous day were gone, replaced by normal animal prints: deer, raccoon, maybe a fox. No sign of anything unusual, no disturbance of the soil, nothing to explain the sounds I had heard. The forest around the clearing looked ordinary, peaceful even, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed slightly heavier, every rustle in the underbrush slightly sharper. I tried to focus on writing again, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, but my attention kept returning to the windows. I kept imagining movement just beyond sight. The growls replayed in my mind, low and deliberate, as if something had been testing the boundaries of the cabin while I slept. By mid-morning, the unease had grown into a tight knot in my chest. I decided to walk further into the woods, telling myself I needed to clear my head. The forest was dense but manageable, and I stayed within sight of the clearing. I noticed birds taking flight at odd moments, a rustling in the underbrush, but still no clear sign of anything unusual. I turned back after an hour, my nerves taut, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I spent the rest of the day packing. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the shadows heavier. Even the ordinary sounds of the forest seemed threatening. By late afternoon, I had everything ready to leave. I walked one last time around the clearing, noticing again the normal animal tracks in the dirt, the light glinting off the leaves, the quiet hum of the forest. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. I drove back down the dirt road with a sense of relief that I couldn't entirely explain. The city skyline waiting in the distance. Even now, thinking about that night makes my skin crawl. The tracks, the growls, the shadows, they were all real, but I still can't explain them. I didn't see anyone, I didn't see an animal that could make that sound. There was no hint of how or why it happened. I tell myself it was a misinterpretation, that the mind can play tricks in isolation. But when I close my eyes, I can still hear the low growls and feel the weight of the darkness just beyond the cabin. I have no evidence, no explanation, and yet I know one thing for certain. I won't be staying alone in the woods again.